January 1943. Dawn breaks slowly over a frozen European continent. In the east, the Volga River lies locked beneath thick ice. Smoke drifts low across shattered factories. At Stalingrad, men huddle in ruins that no longer resemble a city. Boots crunch over frozen rubble. Breath hangs in the air, white and heavy. The sound of distant artillery never fully fades. To the west, blackout curtains remain drawn in London, even as the night air begins to lift. Somewhere over the Atlantic, bombers trace unseen paths through cloud and darkness, their engines steady, relentless. In North Africa, the sun rises hard and fast over sand and steel, illuminating columns of tanks pressing toward each other across open desert. Europe stands at a crossroads. For more than 3 years, Nazi Germany has dominated the continent with speed, force, and terror. Its armies have marched from the Arctic Circle to the gates of the Caucasus. Its enemies have suffered defeat after defeat, retreat after retreat. Yet now, in early 1943, something has shifted. The war has not ended, but the direction of history has begun to change. What unfolds over the next 12 months will decide the fate of Europe and redefine modern warfare forever. And it begins here. By the beginning of 1943, the Second World War in Europe had entered its 4th year. What had begun as a rapid German campaign of conquest had evolved into a grinding, industrial struggle stretching across continents. The early momentum that once defined Nazi warfare, speed, surprise, and overwhelming force, was slowly eroding under the weight of distance, resistance, and attrition. In June 1941, Germany had launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in history. More than 3 million Axis soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union along a front nearly 3,000 kilometers long. The Wehrmacht advanced with confidence. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Kiev fell. Minsk collapsed. By autumn, German forces stood within sight of Moscow's outer defenses. But Barbarossa failed to deliver its decisive blow. The Red Army did not collapse. Soviet industry, dismantled and transported east beyond the Ural Mountains, continued to produce tanks, guns, and aircraft at an astonishing pace. Winter arrived early and brutally. German troops, unprepared for sub-zero temperatures, found their vehicles frozen, their weapons jammed, their supply lines stretched to the breaking point. In December 1941, Soviet counteroffensives forced the first major German retreat of the war. Despite this setback, Adolf Hitler refused to adjust his strategic vision. In 1942, German focus shifted south. The objective was oil, the lifeblood of modern mechanized warfare. Operation Blue aimed to seize the Caucasus oil fields and cut the Soviet Union's access to vital resources. Along the way stood the city of Stalingrad, a major industrial hub and symbolic target bearing Stalin's name. The battle that followed became one of the most brutal confrontations in human history. By late summer 1942, German Sixth Army had pushed into the city. Street by street, floor by floor, soldiers fought at distances measured in meters. Factories, apartment blocks, and cellars became killing grounds. Casualties mounted into the hundreds of thousands. Yet the Soviet defenders held. In November, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, encircling the German forces. By January 1943, the Sixth Army was trapped, starving, freezing, and slowly being annihilated. Stalingrad was not yet over, but its outcome was becoming inevitable. While the Eastern Front consumed men and material at an unprecedented scale, the situation elsewhere in Europe was also evolving. In the skies over Germany, Britain's Royal Air Force had shifted towards sustained strategic bombing. Night after night, heavy bombers crossed the North Sea, targeting industrial cities. The raids were costly and controversial, but they forced Germany to divert fighters, anti-aircraft guns, and resources away from the front lines. Meanwhile, the United States, newly entered into the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, was beginning to make its presence felt. American factories were transforming into engines of war. Tanks, aircraft, trucks, and ships rolled off assembly lines in numbers unmatched by any nation in history. By 1943, this industrial power was beginning to reach European battlefields. In North Africa, Allied forces fought their first large-scale campaigns against the German army. Early encounters exposed inexperience and weakness, but also provided crucial lessons. Command structures were refined. Cooperation between air, land, and naval forces improved. New leaders emerged, hardened by combat and failure. Germany, for all its early victories, was now fighting a war on multiple fronts. Its economy, though formidable, was not fully mobilized until late. Political interference increasingly distorted military decision-making, and the assumption that enemies would collapse under pressure proved dangerously flawed. As 1943 began, no single battle had yet decided the war in Europe. Germany still occupied vast territories. Its armies remained lethal, its ideology uncompromising. But the balance was shifting slowly, inexorably, and the year ahead would expose whether the Reich could adapt or whether it had already passed the point of no return. The strategic landscape of Europe in early 1943 was defined not only by battlefield positions, but by the deeper forces shaping the war beneath the surface. Logistics, production, manpower, and leadership, factors often invisible to soldiers at the front, were beginning to weigh decisively against Nazi Germany. By this stage of the war, the Reich was locked into a conflict it could no longer easily control. Germany's military doctrine had been designed for short, decisive campaigns. Blitzkrieg relied on speed, coordination, and psychological shock. It worked brilliantly against Poland in 1939 and France in 1940. But in the vast spaces of the Soviet Union, and against enemies capable of absorbing punishment and regenerating strength, that doctrine lost its advantage. The German army in 1943 was still highly skilled, but it was no longer the force that had swept across Europe just 3 years earlier. Combat losses had removed thousands of experienced officers and non-commissioned leaders. Replacements were younger, less trained, and often rushed to the front. Equipment shortages became increasingly common. Vehicles were abandoned for lack of fuel or spare parts. Horses, not trucks, hauled supplies across muddy roads. Fuel, above all, haunted German planners. Synthetic fuel plants in Germany could not fully replace natural oil supplies. The Romanian oil fields at Ploiești were vulnerable to air attack. The failure to secure the Caucasus meant that Germany's fuel crisis would only deepen. Every offensive, every movement, every aircraft sortie now carried a strategic cost. In contrast, the Allies were accelerating. The Soviet Union, despite staggering losses, had stabilized its front and reorganized its war economy. Entire cities of factories, Chelyabinsk, Sverdlovsk, Magnitogorsk, operated around the clock. The T-34 tank, rugged and easy to manufacture, rolled out in ever-growing numbers. Soviet commanders learned from early disasters, adopting flexible defenses, layered reserves, and massive artillery coordination. Britain, having survived the worst years alone, now shared the burden. Its navy controlled vital sea lanes. Its intelligence services, aided by code-breaking successes, provided insight into German. The United States added a new dimension entirely. American manpower seemed limitless. Its logistical reach spanned oceans. By 1943, U.S. Army Air Forces were flying daylight bombing raids over occupied Europe, complementing British night attacks. The combined air offensive marked a shift in the war's character, one that increasingly targeted Germany's capacity to fight, not just its armies. Politically, the Axis alliance showed signs of strain. Italy, weakened by defeats in North Africa and suffering from internal discontent, could no longer sustain prolonged warfare. Smaller Axis partners, Hungary, Romania, and Finland, began to question the costs of continued commitment. The unity that Germany relied upon was fragile. At the top, Adolf Hitler tightened his personal control over military decisions. Generals were overruled. Retreats were forbidden. Positions were to be held at all costs, regardless of tactical reality. This rigidity would prove disastrous. What had once been operational daring hardened into inflexibility. Yet Germany remained dangerous. Its defensive lines were formidable. Its soldiers fought with discipline and resolve. New weapons, heavy tanks like the Tiger, advanced aircraft, and improved anti-tank guns entered service. In 1943, the Reich was not collapsing. It was adapting, even as pressures mounted. The question facing Europe was no longer whether the war would continue, but whether Germany could regain the initiative or whether the momentum slipping from its grasp would accelerate beyond recovery. That question would be answered not by one front alone, but through a convergence of human endurance, industrial might, command decisions, and battlefield innovation. And it would be tested from multiple angles. By 1943, the war in Europe had ceased to be a contest of maneuver and had become a test of endurance. Nowhere was this more evident than in the lives of the soldiers and civilians caught within its machinery. On the Eastern Front, entire generations were being consumed. Soviet casualties by early 1943 numbered in the tens of millions, including dead, wounded, and captured. German losses, once considered politically unthinkable, now reached levels that shocked even hardened commanders. At Stalingrad alone, more than 200,000 Axis soldiers would never return. The human experience of the war had grown colder, harsher. Men fought not only the enemy, but exhaustion, hunger, and fear. In frozen trenches and bombed-out cities, survival became the immediate objective. Letters home grew shorter. Silence replaced optimism. Civilians bore an equally crushing burden. Occupied Europe lived under oppression, forced labor, deportation, and famine. In the East, German occupation policy was openly genocidal. Entire villages were erased. In the West, strategic bombing brought war directly into the homes of civilians. Hamburg, Cologne, Essen, names that came to represent firestorms and ruin. By 1943, death was no longer shocking. It was expected, and yet endurance persisted. Soviet workers labored through nights and winters. British civilians returned to factories after air raids. German families adapted to rationing and loss. The war ground forward, sustained by human beings pushed beyond ordinary limits. This mass suffering did not break resolve, it hardened it. And that resolve would shape how armies fought, how leaders decided, and how the war itself evolved. Angle 2. The tactical evolution. Tactically, 1943 marked a turning point in how battles were fought across Europe. The age of rapid armored breakthroughs was fading. In its place emerged layered defenses, concentrated firepower, and operational depth. The Red Army, having survived catastrophic defeats, adapted decisively. Soviet commanders emphasized defense in depth, multiple defensive belts designed to absorb and exhaust German attacks. Minefields, anti-tank obstacles, and artillery zones turned open terrain into lethal corridors. Infantry, armor, and artillery were coordinated with increasing sophistication. German tactics evolved as well, but under constraint. Elite units still executed complex maneuvers, but the margin for error had narrowed. Limited fuel restricted mobility. Air superiority, once assumed, was contested. Every offensive now required meticulous planning, and still risked irreversible losses. Urban warfare became central. Stalingrad demonstrated that cities could neutralize armor and force close-quarters combat. This lesson echoed across the front, influencing how commanders viewed terrain and defense. The war was becoming methodical, brutal, and increasingly unforgiving. And in this environment, success depended less on brilliance and more on sustainability, on which side could endure longer, replace losses faster, and adapt under pressure. Those adaptations would soon be tested on a scale never before seen. By 1943, technology had become the quiet determinant of victory, not through singular wonder weapons, but through the relentless accumulation of reliable, mass-produced systems. Germany still fielded some of the most advanced weapons on the battlefield. The Tiger I tank, introduced in late 1942, possessed formidable armor and firepower. German aircraft designs remained sophisticated. Anti-tank guns grew deadlier, but these systems were complex, expensive, and difficult to replace. Each loss mattered. The Allies pursued a different path. Soviet tanks emphasized simplicity and durability. The T-34 could be repaired in the field. Its sloped armor and wide tracks were well suited to Eastern Front conditions. Production numbers dwarfed German output. Quantity became a form of quality. American industry operated on an unprecedented scale. Liberty ships crossed the Atlantic in constant streams. Trucks standardized logistics. Aircraft flowed in numbers that allowed sustained air campaigns. The war became mechanical, predictable, and overwhelming. Radar, radio communication, and code-breaking quietly reshaped operations. Intelligence allowed anticipation. Coordination improved. Technology no longer dazzled. It enabled. And Germany, increasingly outproduced, could not keep pace. Angle 4. Leadership under pressure. Leadership in 1943 revealed stark contrasts. On the Allied side, learning and adaptation became institutional. Soviet commanders, such as Georgy Zhukov, emphasized coordination and preparation. British and American leaders refined joint command structures. Failures were analyzed, not concealed. In Germany, command narrowed. Adolf Hitler's distrust of his generals deepened. Decisions centralized at the top. Orders demanded absolute obedience, even when conditions demanded flexibility. This rigidity proved fatal. At Stalingrad, the refusal to permit breakout sealed the Sixth Army's fate. Similar decisions would follow. Leadership no longer compensated for material inferiority. It magnified it. Angle 5. The enemy's perspective. For German soldiers in 1943, the war felt different. Confidence gave way to tension. Victories were local, temporary. Losses were permanent. Many still believed in ultimate victory. Others sensed that the war had become unwinnable. Letters home reflected confusion and fatigue. Across the lines, Allied soldiers sensed momentum. Not certainty, but possibility. The psychological balance had shifted. And with it, the war moved toward its decisive test. The turning point of 1943 did not arrive in a single moment. It emerged through a sequence of battles whose combined weight altered the course of the war. At their center stood two events that reshaped Europe's future: the collapse of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, and the German decision to stake everything on one final, calculated offensive in the East. On February 2nd, 1943, the Battle of Stalingrad ended. What remained of the Sixth Army, once one of Germany's finest formations, ceased organized resistance. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, promoted only days earlier in the expectation that he would fight to the death, surrendered instead. Nearly 90,000 German soldiers marched into captivity. Few would ever return. It was the first complete destruction of a German field army in the war. The psychological impact was immense. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became proof that the Wehrmacht could be encircled, broken, and annihilated. For Germany, it was a shock that propaganda could not fully conceal. Church bells did not ring. Public mourning was forbidden, but the silence spoke for itself. Yet even after Stalingrad, the war's outcome was not sealed. German forces stabilized the front in the spring of 1943. New defensive lines were formed. Reserves were gathered. And within the German High Command, a plan took shape. One last attempt to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. The focus became a bulge in the front lines near the city of Kursk. There, Soviet forces had pushed westward, creating a salient that extended deep into German-held territory. To Hitler and his generals, it appeared vulnerable. If attacked from north and south simultaneously, the bulge could be pinched off, trapping large Soviet formations and restoring German momentum. The operation was named Operation Citadel. Preparation consumed months. Germany assembled elite armored units, including newly formed panzer divisions, equipped with Tiger and Panther tanks. It delayed the offensive repeatedly, waiting for more tanks, more training, more certainty. Each delay allowed the Soviets to strengthen their defenses. By the time the German attack was ready, the Red Army knew it was coming. Soviet intelligence, reinforced by reconnaissance and intercepted communications, revealed the timing and direction of the assault. What followed was one of the most extensive defensive preparations in military history. Minefields were laid in layers. Trenches zigzagged across the steppe. Anti-tank guns were positioned in depth. Entire armies waited, not to advance, but to absorb the blow. When the German offensive finally began in July 1943, it did not strike an unprepared enemy. It collided with a wall. The opening days saw ferocious fighting. German armor advanced under fire. Tanks burned across open fields. Progress was measured in kilometers, then meters. Losses mounted rapidly, especially among irreplaceable vehicles and crews. At Prokhorovka, one of the largest armored clashes in history erupted. At close range, dust, smoke, and confusion erased clarity. Both sides suffered heavy losses, but the outcome favored the defender. For the first time, a major German summer offensive failed to achieve its objectives. The initiative slipped away, and it would never return. As the German attack at Kursk stalled, events beyond the battlefield sealed its fate. The failure was not sudden, but cumulative, a slow recognition that the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. Within days of the offensive's launch, German commanders faced an impossible arithmetic. Tank losses were heavy. Replacement vehicles arrived slowly. Fuel consumption outpaced supply. Air support, once dominant, was now contested by growing numbers of Soviet aircraft. Each kilometer gained cost more than Germany could afford. On July 12, 1943, even as fighting raged near Prokhorovka, news arrived from the West. Allied forces had landed in Sicily. The invasion of Italy opened a new front, forcing Germany to divert divisions, aircraft, and attention away from the Eastern Front. Hitler ordered Operation Citadel halted. The decision marked more than the end of a single offensive. It symbolized the end of Germany's capacity to dictate the course of the war in the East. From this point forward, the Wehrmacht would fight primarily on the defensive, reacting to Soviet initiatives rather than shaping them. The Red Army moved quickly. Within weeks, Soviet forces launched counteroffensives along a broad front. Cities previously lost in 1941 and 1942 were recaptured. German units retreated under constant pressure, fighting delaying actions rather than decisive battles. The Dnieper River, once envisioned as a defensive barrier, was crossed by Soviet troops through relentless assaults. In the air, the shift was equally pronounced. Allied bombing intensified. German industry struggled to recover from repeated raids. Aircraft production continued, but pilot training suffered. Experienced aircrews were lost faster than they could be replaced. Control of the skies became increasingly contested and increasingly tilted toward the Allies. On the home front, the consequences of 1943 became visible. Total war was declared in Germany. Civilian life narrowed. Women and forced laborers filled factories. Yet even as mobilization increased, the gap between Axis capacity and Allied output widened. Strategically, the Allies began to coordinate on a scale previously impossible. The Soviet advance in the East synchronized with Allied pressure in the Mediterranean and escalating air campaigns in the West. Germany's strategic dilemma deepened. Every reinforcement sent to one front weakened another. The war was no longer about German victory. It had become a struggle to delay defeat. And that realization spread, quietly but unmistakably, through command rooms, factories, and frontline positions alike. The year 1943 did not end the war, but it changed its direction permanently. What followed would be shaped by this moment, by the losses incurred, the initiative surrendered, and the psychological shift that no order could reverse. The consequences of that turning point now unfolded across Europe. By late 1943, the effects of the year's turning point were unmistakable. The map of Europe had not yet been redrawn, but the momentum beneath it had shifted decisively. Germany still occupied vast territories, but it now did so under constant pressure, forced into reactive decisions rather than deliberate strategy. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army pressed westward with growing confidence. Following Kursk, Soviet operations expanded in scale and ambition. Offensive after offensive drove German forces out of Ukraine. Kharkov, retaken and lost multiple times earlier in the war, fell again, this time permanently. The Dnieper defensive line, once considered a natural barrier, failed to hold. These advances came at tremendous cost. Soviet casualties remained staggering. Entire divisions were expended to gain ground measured in kilometers. Yet unlike Germany, the Soviet Union could replace its losses. New formations arrived continuously. Equipment flowed from factories that now operated beyond the reach of German bombers. For the Wehrmacht, retreat. Those limits would become clearer as the consequences of 1943 continued to unfold. As 1943 drew to a close, the strategic consequences of the year's turning point extended beyond the battlefield and into the structure of the war itself. What had changed was not only who was advancing, but how the conflict would now be fought until its end. Germany entered 1944 on the defensive everywhere. In the East, the Wehrmacht faced an enemy that now planned and executed operations across entire fronts with coordinated timing. Soviet offensives were no longer isolated blows. They were sustained campaigns designed to destroy German formations systematically. The Red Army's command structure matured, allowing it to exploit breakthroughs rapidly and deny German forces the chance to regroup. In the West, Allied preparations accelerated. The air war had weakened German defenses and gathered intelligence essential for future operations. Every bombing raid forced Germany to commit fighters and guns to homeland defense, resources that could not be used at the front. The Atlantic Wall was strengthened, but never adequately manned or equipped. The balance of manpower became decisive. Germany increasingly relied on older men, younger conscripts, and foreign labor. Training periods shortened. Unit cohesion suffered. Meanwhile, Allied forces grew stronger, better equipped, and more experienced with each passing month. The industrial imbalance widened relentlessly. By the end of 1943, the Allies were producing aircraft, tanks, and vehicles at rates Germany could not hope to match. Even successful German defensive actions could no longer alter the strategic equation. Politically, the Axis position weakened further. Italy's defection encouraged other Axis partners to reconsider their commitment. Diplomatic maneuvering increased behind the scenes, reflecting the recognition that Germany's war aims were unattainable. The war's tone also shifted. German leadership emphasized sacrifice and resilience, but the language of victory faded. Allied messaging, by contrast, increasingly spoke of liberation, return, and inevitability. The turning point of 1943 thus reshaped expectations. Victory for Germany became improbable. Defeat became a question of time. Yet the war would continue for nearly 2 more years. The fighting ahead would be among the most destructive in European history. Cities would fall. Armies would be destroyed. Millions more would die. The end was not yet visible, but the path to it had been set. And understanding that path requires stepping back from battles and maps to consider what 1943 ultimately meant. 1943 was the year Europe turned, not through a single battle, but through a convergence of attrition, endurance, and human will. Stalingrad and Kursk were more than military events. They were symbols of limits reached and momentum reversed. For the first time, the Wehrmacht was on the defensive across every major front. German soldiers, once feared for their relentless advance, now faced an enemy that could absorb, adapt, and outproduce them. Civilians felt the war encroach ever closer, while factories, airfields, and railways became decisive instruments of victory. Technology, leadership, and industrial might had combined to redefine the battlefield. the human element remained central. The courage of defenders, the resilience of civilians, and a leadership of commanders willing to adapt under unimaginable pressure transformed the war from one of conquest to one of endurance. It revealed that victory is rarely determined by brilliance alone, but by the capacity to endure, recover, and persist. Ultimately, 1943 exposed the tipping point of modern total war. It demonstrated the limits of ideology against logistics, the fragility of rigid command against adaptive strategy, and the power of collective effort over individual genius. History had shifted. The continent had begun its slow, painful march toward liberation and reconstruction. In the cold winter of that year, as Europe reeled from losses and victories alike, the future was no longer written by fear. It was being forged by resilience.